Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our webinar series for the Hawaii BEAD challenge process. My name is Micah, and I have with me on the call my colleague Susan Harai. And for today's webinar, we'll be covering a brief overview of what we are challenging, but we'll primarily cover the different types of challenges, including the evidence and rebuttal details for each of the types. After each of the challenge types, there will be a brief opportunity for you to ask any questions. But if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A. So to begin, as a reminder for everyone, the goal of the challenge process is to create the best map of internet infrastructure in Hawaii. And the UH will be using this information from the challenge process to determine where to spend the BEAD funding that was allocated to the state to ultimately build out high-speed internet for those that do not have it. And so this challenge process, what we're not doing, again, is we are not submitting challenges to add or remove locations, aka dots, from our challenge map, nor are we also trying to submit any corrections on the map, such as the address, the unit count, or the location type. The challenge process is instead submitting challenges to identify one of 5 things, either to identify community anchor institutions or CAIs, and any CAIs that lack that 1 gigabit infrastructure symmetrical speeds, identify any served, unserved, and underserved locations, as well as any enforceable commitments or planned service locations. When submitting a challenge to identify locations that lack or have internet infrastructure, you will need to select one of 11 challenge types, as you can see on our screen. And the goal is that by selecting one of these challenge types, you'll be explaining why the location is eligible for BEAD or ineligible for BEAD funding, and then you'll have to provide evidence to justify that challenge. And so the remainder of this presentation will be covering each of these 11 challenge types and evidence needed. So to start is the availability challenge. The availability challenge's goal is to identify locations that do not have a high-speed internet infrastructure available. This challenge applies to locations that may show on the challenge map as served, meaning that they have high-speed internet infrastructure at the location, but in reality, you do not. And some scenarios when this challenge would apply is if you tried calling an internet service provider and they said that they can provide service, but you would have to pay an exorbitant fee, more than a standard fee, such as to install like a utility pole, or it would, because it's so far back, you would have to run a lot of fiber to your location. So this is that's an example of when an availability challenge would apply. Another is if you tried calling your ISP or contacting them and they simply say that they cannot provide service to your location, and you try or they do advertise, but you indeed can't, then again, this challenge would apply. For community anchor institutions specifically, this challenge applies for if you can't get access to that 1,000 megabits per second symmetrical speeds. So for this challenge, the evidence you need to provide is some documentation in the form of an email or a letter or some screenshot on the ISP's website. As an example, in the past 6 months, the ISP cannot serve your address for some of the reasons stated earlier. And as a reminder, if you do successfully submit the evidence, the proper evidence, and this challenge goes through the rebuttal phase, the provider will have the opportunity to rebut the challenge. And they will need to provide some sort of evidence as well, in the form of something like, or specifically for an availability challenge, in the form of saying like, there is a customer bill at this location, so there is service available, or some other way of showing that there is high-speed internet infrastructure available. The next challenge to go over is the speed challenge. And the speed challenge's goal is to identify locations that do not have high-speed internet infrastructure to support at least 120 megabits per second. So that's 100 down, 20 up megabits per second speeds, and is therefore considered unserved. For CAIs, again, that's that 1,000 megabit per second symmetrical. So for this challenge, the location may have some high-speed internet infrastructure in theory, but in reality, it can't support that 120 speeds, which is what the speed challenge is trying to show. And this speed challenge applies to locations where the internet plan that you're subscribed to is above 120, or for CAIs, again, 1,000 symmetrical. And so, for example, if you're subscribed to an internet plan below 120, you actually can't file this challenge because of the evidence requirements for this speed challenge. And the evidence for a speed challenge is as follows. So you will need to take 3 speed tests on different days, and the days don't have to be consecutive. Each of those 3 speed tests must be taken at least 60 days prior to the start of the challenge process. This date is tentative. But for each of those 3 speed tests, on the speed test, you must show the time, the date, and the internet protocol or IP address. The speed test must be done on a laptop, desktop computer, or a mobile device, but you will want to be standing as close as possible to your router if you're connected on Wi-Fi through your mobile device. And then finally, this is a key point, which is why I mentioned only those that are subscribed to over 120 megabits per second can file, is that you need to submit as part of the challenge your name, your address, and a copy of your last internet bill. For the ISPs to rebut this speed challenge, they have to do similar things as shown on the previous slide. They also need to have 3 speed tests taken at a certain time period prior to the start of the challenge. But they have additional requirements as well, as in they have to provide speed test data for at least 10% of a randomly selected customers in that challenge area. They must apply the 80-80 rule to these locations. And the speed test must be done between the hours of 7 p.m. and 11 p.m. Hawaiʻi Standard Time. So this is what the ISPs need to provide. I know there's a lot of information for the speed test challenge, and it's quite complicated. So for those who are interested in filing a speed challenge, we can provide some sort of documentation, some checklist on what you need to provide. And then also, as the medium to take the speed test, our vendor for the challenge portal will have a public-facing module to take speed tests. And this speed test will be fully compliant with all the requirements that we need for the speed challenge. And so some scenarios to go over to help understand, again, when a speed challenge is applicable are as follows. So in scenario 1, someone is subscribed to a 300 by 10 internet plan. Again, the speed challenge will not apply to this location because the plan that they are not subscribed to is not at least 120. In scenario 2, a location has 2 providers A and B. You're subscribed on 120 internet plan from provider A, but provider B offers fiber at speeds up to 1,000 over 500. And a speed challenge might not change the location status to underserved because there are two providers and provider B can provide access to over 120. And again, BEAD's goal is to provide internet infrastructure for locations that do not have the infrastructure. And in scenario 3, this is if there's only one provider at your location and you can get up to 120 megabits, 100 over 20 megabits per second, and you're subscribed to that plan. A speed challenge could apply to this location because there is only one provider and your speed tests, if taken properly with the evidence as shown earlier, would be showing less than 120, and if there's no rebuttal. The next challenge that I'm going over is very similar to a speed challenge, and that's the latency challenge. And the reason why it's so similar is because a lot of the requirements for speed are the same for latency. The goal of this latency challenge is to show that instead of the speeds, we're focusing on the latency of the infrastructure. And the goal of this challenge is to show that the infrastructure cannot support less than 100 milliseconds round trip latency. And if you're unfamiliar, latency essentially means the delay in the service when you're sending or receiving data. And so if on your internet subscription plan, you are constantly getting over 100 milliseconds round trip latency, this challenge could apply to you. And the evidence that you would need to provide, same thing as the speed challenge, except again, focusing on the latency number instead of the speeds, the download and upload speeds. And the rebuttal for ISP is the same, again, except focusing on latency. And I have here on the screen an example speed test, particularly from Ookla, where you can see the latency number, which is this right here. The next challenge is called the data cap challenge. And the data cap challenge's goal is to show that you can't get high-speed internet because there's a limit to the amount of data that you get on your internet plan. And this is specific, again, to like home internet, Wi-Fi, not cellular internet, such as your mobile data plan. And this challenge applies when an internet service provider's plan markets to consumers that your plan, if you subscribe to it, would be subject to some sort of cap, some sort of limit that is less than 600 gigabits per month. And so a scenario, again, how this would apply is, say you're subscribed to residential or business internet, but there's a condition on your plan where it says you can get internet up to certain limit of data, and then your speeds will slow down. Or you have to pay more once you go over that limit. And so the evidence that you would need to provide for the data cap challenge is some screenshot of your provider's internet plan on their webpage or on their terms of service showing that there is some sort of data cap. And the rebuttal that the provider can provide is showing that their terms of service doesn't have that data cap or offers another plan without that data cap. I will be moving on to the technology challenge. And the technology challenge's goal is to show that the technology that your location has is mismatched with what is being claimed by the provider. And so this challenge applies when the technology that you actually are subscribed to is not matching what is shown on the provider's page or on our challenge map. And so say, for example, the challenge map says that your internet service provider can provide fiber to your location, but in reality, they're providing satellite to your location. This is when a technology challenge would apply because there's a mismatch between the technologies of what's claimed and what's real. So for this challenge, the evidence that you would need to provide is a picture of the modem, the router, or some sort of device that provides internet to the location with the manufacturer and model number, showing what type of internet service that you're actually getting. And the provider can submit a rebuttal evidence showing that you can actually, they have the technology to support what is being claimed on their map. I shall be moving on to the business service only challenge. The business service only challenge type's goal is to show that a residential location cannot get high-speed internet because they can only get business internet. And so a scenario when this applies is you tried contacting an ISP for service at your home, but they said you cannot get internet service. But when you try to go online to get business service, it says that you can get service. And so the evidence that you need to provide for this business challenge is a screenshot of the provider webpage, email, or letter, some sort of documentation showing that you can get business service even though you're residential, and that you can't subscribe to residential service. An important note to this challenge is that the location has to be a residential location for this challenge to apply. The rebuttal that a provider can give is that the documentation is actually, that the service provided can actually be for residential as well. I'm going to move on to CAI challenges. This location is a CAI challenge. The goal of this one is to identify community anchor institutions, CAIs in Hawaii. And so you would file this challenge if there's a location that should be classified as a CAI, but it's not. And it should because it meets the initial proposal volume 1 definition that we have for a CAI. So if you're unfamiliar with volume 1, a quick overview is that there are certain CAIs that are defined within the Notice of Funding Opportunity or NOFO, and those are the first 7 that you can read on the screen here. And then there are also ones that are called community support organizations, and UH has defined 4 categories of those that would also be considered CAIs. And the guiding principle between deciding what was a CAI or not is these 4 criteria. And that is if the location has a physical location, so not like some sort of temporary structure where we can deploy broadband to, that would facilitate greater use of broadband by vulnerable populations. Also that the location needs to be dedicated to the organization's usage. So the location is not someone's house in addition to that, as an example. Also that the organization's mission at the location involves or plans to involve activities that would help facilitate broadband usage by vulnerable populations. And then finally, that it would be public facing in nature, meaning that there's no paid or unpaid memberships to access that location before using its services. And so if the location falls into the CAI definition, to submit evidence, you just need to provide some sort of documentation, such as a website, screenshot, brochure, flyer, showing that it meets the CAI definition. And for a rebuttal, you can show the opposite, that why it's not a CAI, or that the CAI is closed, is actually residential, et cetera, et cetera. We ask that if you are providing some sort of documentation with an address, that it would show the physical address, aka the building's location address, instead of the mailing address. The counterpart to this location is a CAI is not a CAI challenge. And as the name suggests, this is the opposite to identify locations that may be misclassified as a CAI in Hawaii. And so you would use this challenge if the location is on our CAI list, and it shouldn't be because it's a resident or a not CAI business, or it's just not in operation anymore. Or the location is just incorrectly placed for the CAI. And so the evidence you provide for CAI, not a CAI challenge, is the opposite of what was just mentioned earlier, where you would provide evidence showing that, yeah, this location is not a CAI because it's a resident, it's no longer in operation, or it doesn't meet the definition. And you have documentation showing why. A rebuttal is showing that this location is a CAI, and therefore, this is how it meets the definition. And if you notice, between the CAI challenges, this is open to anybody that's an eligible permissible entity, and a rebuttal can be made by any eligible permissible entity. And this is the plan service challenge. The plan service challenge goal is to identify any locations that will get high-speed internet infrastructure deployed to its location without BEAD funding. And so this challenge applies if the location will get internet infrastructure deployed to the location by June 30th, 2024, without some sort of enforceable commitment. And the idea behind this is that we wouldn't want to, again, duplicate what's already there. So this challenge is to identify locations that will already be getting service and therefore will not need BEAD funding to be used to deploy there. This challenge is really more internet service provider, ISP focus, because again, only they would know where they're planning service. And so to file a challenge, what the ISP would need to provide is construction contracts or permits or any sort of evidence showing that there is active deployment to that location and that the deployment would be completed by June 30th of 2024. The rebuttals that can be given by any one of the eligible challengers, again, is somehow documentation that the provider is not going to be providing internet there, or they're not going to be able to meet their planned commitments. Or that even though that they're deploying there, what they're deploying does not meet the BEAD performance and technology requirements. The last two challenges that we have, and they are enforceable commitment challenges. And an enforceable commitment is basically some sort of contract. The goal of the enforceable commitment challenge is to identify locations that are under some sort of contract to receive high-speed internet infrastructure. And the reason why we want to have some sort of challenge like this filed is because part of the requirements for BEAD is that we cannot duplicate the internet infrastructure for something that's already being funded. And so, for example, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF, would be an enforceable commitment, and locations in that area would not be eligible for BEAD funding if this challenge is successful, because there's already funding being provided to provide internet infrastructure So to file this challenge, the evidence that you need to provide is some sort of legal document, such as an authorization letter, a contract, maybe even a screenshot on the government website showing that this commitment is in place and where it's happening. A rebuttal for this is if the location is actually not part of the enforceable commitment for whatever reason, or that you have some proof that the provider has defaulted on their commitment, so they can't actually finish this contract and service all the areas in the commitment. And yeah, that's evidence. On the flip side, for this last challenge is the not enforceable commitment challenge. And so this applies to locations that would be an enforceable commitment. So you're trying to identify locations that actually are not part of an enforceable commitment. So it's the opposite. And therefore, we should consider them for BEAD funding because it's not going to be duplicative. And this challenge would apply to locations that, again, would be an area that may be in an enforceable commitment, but not 100% of the locations in that commitment area would be served for whatever reason. So to file this challenge, the evidence that you would need is some evidence that the location is not in the commitment area, or for some reason isn't part of the scope of that commitment, or that the provider actually can't meet its commitment. The rebuttal is the enforceable commitment evidence, which is that actually the provider has not defaulted, it can meet the commitment, it's able to service all of the locations in that commitment area. And so therefore, it is part of the enforceable commitment. In terms of next steps that you can take, thank you for joining this webinar. You can visit the UH Broadband website on the initial proposal page for the list of CAIs. It's at the bottom of the page. So if you're looking to file a CAI challenge, you can look at the list there. Would also recommend you to sign up for the Connect Kako email newsletter, as we'll be sending a lot of information about the challenge process through there. Some other next steps is that we'll be providing more virtual and in-person training sessions that are coming in the month of June and throughout the process. So check back frequently to the UH's website or subscribe to our newsletter to learn more of when these training dates will happen and where. And then finally, very soon, we'll be opening registration for the challenge process. So if you're a nonprofit, a unit of local government, so that's the counties or a state, or an internet service provider, you can begin to register for the challenge process. And that will help us to know who's interested in participating, and then we can get you connected with resources or people who will also be participating in the challenge process as well. Please do note that you want to have this information beforehand before you start registering. And some of that would be your IRS employee identification number, your EIN. If you're an ISP, you will also need to provide your FCC registration number. And then finally, this information is optional, but it could help us verify your identity. Some sort of registration from the Hawaii DCCA, Department of Consumer Affairs, or some other documentation verifying your identity.